was a rare sight in Congress, a hearing on reparations held yesterday in one of the many buildings in Washington built on slave labor. Journalist and author Ta-Nehisi Coates helped kickstart this round of the reparations debate. Joining me now is Ta-Nehisi Coates, author of 3 best-selling books, recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, current author of the Marvel Comics of Black Panther and Captain America, and his debut novel, The Water Dancer, which is exceptional and I finished a night ago, will be published in September. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Well, you've never testified at a congressional hearing before?
No.
What was it like?
There was no possible way to prepare for it. It was completely dizzying. I think the particular intensity, I mean, as I was joking, you see I still have the same suit on, so, I mean, that's a statement. I apologize, Black Twitter. But it was dizzying. I mean, and I think the particular energy around this one was just like, I mean, unlike anything I'd ever seen. You know, I'm a writer, I'm a journalist. I'm used to writing things and then, you know what I mean, going ahead and doing whatever I'm, doing. But this is proving to be quite different.
Well, it's interesting to me, the moment that we're at for this particular issue. I mean, this is not, the issue did not arise with your Atlantic article. It's long-standing, and as you say in that article and say at every opportunity, it's built upon decades and decades of scholarship and other folks. But it does feel like there's a moment now where it has achieved a degree of mainstream legitimacy that is new.
Right. I think 2 things are responsible for that. The first is, and this is not fair, but I think the Atlantic enjoys a kind of space among quote-unquote very serious people. So I just have to be frank. And I actually knew this at the time. Look, people can be right up one side and down the other about something, but when an outlet with a kind of cachet among certain people says it, it becomes a little different. Again, that's not fair. And the second part of that is I think Trump particularly following Barack Obama has had a kind of radicalizing effect on a lot of people, I think.
One of the things that we hear a lot about, and you talked about yesterday, and I want to play the sound of Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, the sort of the big argument against it always. There's a bunch of arguments, but the big one is, look, this was a long time ago, and no one alive today is responsible for it. Take a listen to what they had to say.
I just think we're so far removed from the event. It was the original sin of the country, and I think let's just make it a more perfect union rather than looking backward, because I don't know where it stops when you do that.
No one currently alive was responsible for that. And I don't think we should be trying to figure out how to compensate for it. First of all, it'd be pretty hard to figure out who to compensate.
You addressed that directly yesterday in the testimony.
I did. I think that's a very opportunistic notion of citizenship. As I said yesterday, we obviously have ties and debts and credits that we acknowledge that go in fact far back beyond the time when the last slaveholder and the last enslaved person died. I mean, you can just look at the building in which these people work. You work in a capital that was built by enslaved people. You are there enjoying the benefits of their labor. If we don't want to acknowledge our ties to the back, how about you go work out on the Anacostia River, somewhere or something like that? And I'm being flip about that, but this is, very true. As I was doing the research for that testimony. As late as 2017, we were paying pensions to the last heir of a Civil War veteran. We are at this very moment still paying pensions to veterans from the Spanish-American War, World War I. I mean, things that happened long before, I was alive and you were alive, and yet we don't have any problem with that.
And one of the points that struck me about the Georgetown story, and I think Georgetown's fascinating, right? Because here's this isn't the whole country. It's one university. Right. It's a laboratory. It's a little pilot program. Right. But in that case, it's like, there are records of this stuff.
Oh, sure.
Like, they have the 272 names. They have the amount of money that they're going to spend. Right. And they have a community where they could track the descendants.
I mean, listen, the first thing is, as I said yesterday, this isn't just about enslavement, right? So, yes, you can actually track enslavement. But Jim Crow, I mean, that's easy. I went and found them. I did that,
The opening of that article in The Atlantic is an interview with a homeowner from Chicago, the west side of Chicago.
Right. So it's not actually hard to find people that were victimized, that suffered, that lost wealth, or had wealth stolen from them underneath it. And as far as I'm concerned, people who, feel like, well, the problem here is we can't identify, who it is, why don't you support H.R. 40 and then let's find out? Because H.R. 40 is just a study. Why don't we find out? That's my challenge. Okay, you feel like that? Possibly you're right. Support the study and then let's find out.
Right. The legislation that you were testifying on tomorrow, right? Yesterday. is essentially to commission a study to look into all of these different sort of particularities about the logistics of it.
Right. And so if your objection is procedural, well, I don't know, if, we can find these people. Let's have the study. That's what the study's for.
Right.
How much are we going to pay? Who are we going to pay it to? That's why we need a study.
Right.
Let's have the study. The other thing I have to add, Chris, is we did this before. This is not unprecedented. We did this with Japanese Americans who were interned rightfully during the period of World War II. So it's not like we've never done this before. The city of Chicago has done reparations for the victims of John Burge. The state of North Carolina has actually done reparations for the victims of what was basically a statewide eugenics policy practice against black women and poor women. So this is not unfounded, territory here.
I want to ask you a little bit about the politics of this issue. It's very interesting to me. So you're getting, you have candidates get asked about it. Mitch McConnell gets asked about it. It is in the bloodstream of the American political body politic. But here's the polling on it. 4 different polls. Marist, Data for Progress, which leans left, Fox News, Rasmussen. They're all with about 25, 26%, and big majorities saying no, 68, 46, 60, 66. My feeling about reparations is that the case substantively is basically ironclad. I'm 100% persuaded. And I think it's political suicide for a national politician to run on it on a national campaign.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that's not my problem. That's not actually my problem. I would not, I don't think any of us would say during the period where, for instance, marriage equality enjoyed terrible poll numbers, that people should have given up the pressure on politicians, that we should have let up on Barack Obama, for instance, or, the Clintons for signing the Defense of Marriage Act. If I, as a writer, and to the extent that, God, I can't believe I'm going to use this word, advocate, to the extent that if I say, well, if it polls well, you know what I mean, that's what I'll be writing about now, then I'm dead. Then I'm dead. The other thing is, I think part of that polling is the result of the fact that we haven't had serious discussions. I think that polling is not an abstract, sort of figure that is not connected to other things. The fact of the matter is we haven't had the kind of discussions that we actually had yesterday. So I think, to the extent that we can push this forward, have serious, substantive conversations like we did yesterday, I would expect that polling to change, actually.
Yeah. Do you think that do you think that one thing that would change that polling is actually talking about some of the nitty-gritty of it?
I do. I mean, listen, there will be... when I wrote the case for reparations in 2014, one of the things that shocked me the most was the sheer number of white people throughout the country who either came up to me or wrote me and said, I didn't know about redlining. Actually, I just legit didn't know. I mean, because as a writer, my perspective is, listen, my job is to tell you the truth. I have no idea what comes after that. At that point, I probably did not view myself. I would have looked askance, for instance, at the possibility of me testifying before Congress. And so one of the things that shocked me was the sheer ignorance. So there's a group of people who legit don't want to know. They don't, you can lay out the facts for them and they just don't care. You're never going to convince them. But at the same time, there's also, a large group of people who literally don't know. They just don't know. They've never, given reparations a serious consideration.
I mean, you and I discuss this all the time in our private conversations about Reconstruction, particularly, and about the birth of Jim Crow. No one knows. No one knows the history of it. I mean,
no one knows.
That chapter is lost. It's memory hold in American history about what happened.
No one knows.
There's a comment I wanted to ask you about Joe Biden made, because it relates directly, right, about the sort of ways that we configure our memory of the past, particularly vis-a-vis white supremacy and segregation, talking about the fact that there were white supremacist, segregationist, Democratic senators that he was elected to sort of oppose. And he did oppose. I mean, he had different views than them, but that he was able to work with them. And he's talking about this old model of how the Senate worked. He's come under criticism for that, and other people's, Cory Booker, among others, have asked him to apologize. I'm just curious what you made of that.
So, listen, the problem here is not that he had polite relationships with people who had deeply, deeply deplorable views. The problem is those very polite relationships were premised on the fact that those people's deeply deplorable views actually disenfranchised an entire sector of the electorate. There's a reason why those polite relationships went away. And part of the reason they went away was because black people are now, a voting force in the South, much to the chagrin of some other people. And so I think there's a lack of acknowledgement Like even
the
his
price of that
privilege
cold peace, the price of that
Yes,
civility
yes,
was that you didn't
racism.
cross them on race. You could deal with all sorts of different things.
Exactly
you could trade horses on a million different things.
And I don't think he, to the extent that I can credit him, I don't think he realizes that.
Right.
Maybe he doesn't want to realize that. But there's a reason why those people were able to be polite with him. And so I think for a lot of black people, when we hear that, it's actually kind of a secondary endorsement, as crazy as this sounds, of Jim Crow. Because Jim Crow was the basis on which that peace was in fact constructed. And so, like,
but you don't think Joe Biden?
That's not the point.
Right.
That's not the point. Like, you can, and that's why I said secondary endorsement, right? Like, what he's endorsing is the peace, right? But the peace is actually built on something quite horrible. And without that horrible thing, there never would have been that civility in the first place.
I mean, the peace built atop horror is the story of American politics.
It's the story of Reconstruction, redemption, and that extends right up, to him having that great relationship with Herman Talmadge.
Well, I should say this, yeah. In the year 2019, it's remarkable how much untold there is about, I mean, or needs to be retold time and time again, which brings me to your novel, which comes out in September, which I just finished.
Ooh, are we talking about this?
We're not talking about it. I'm just going to put some Water Dancer, and it's remarkable, and it's really a beautiful piece of work.
Thank you.
People should check it out. Ta-Nehisi Coates. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.